In this session, we'll explore invoice approval rules. Transportation management uses invoice approval rules to determine which threshold definitions must be satisfied before the invoice can be processed for payment. The invoice approval rules are utilized after an invoice has already passed the invoice matching rule criteria, as was discussed in the previous Transportation Management Explorer topic. In this demonstration, we'll explore an invoice approval rule in Oracle Transportation Management. This allows us to create the rules of how OTM determines if a service provider's matched invoice is within our defined tolerance in order to approve and process for payment. Let's navigate over into our application. Our invoice approval rules are also defined under the financials area. So back to payment rule management, and then to invoice approval rule. Here, we'll work with an existing one. We'll go into this one marked as truckload 3%, which in this case serves as a naming convention, which again can be any alphanumeric naming convention you want. You also have effective dates for from and to if you'd like. You can also take these rules and link them to a specific location of the shipment if you want to make them that granular. Otherwise, by leaving it null, they can be used for multiple situations. You can also make this approval rule specific to a particular mode of transportation. And like the matching rules, you can also determine if the approval rule is for a single standard invoice, consolidated, or for both. In this case, when you define your tolerances, you can determine is the tolerance defined about cost metrics and or weight metrics. Under the cost approval rule, this is where you can determine what kind of a description or range do we need to match between the invoice and the shipment amounts. In this case, we see there's an example of 3% above or below, which means that the invoice total must be within 3% above or below the actual shipment total. You're also able to use the ability to say, in addition to percentage, do we also want to say it could also be up to and or a particular currency amount above or below. The same thing is true with the weight approval rule. If we check the box, then we can determine is there an allowable percentage range above or below the weight listed between the invoice and the shipment, and or a specific amount which is defined as well. Once you define your tolerances, then you can go down to your detail to specify, is this approval rule used for any invoice with those conditions, or do we want to cap it? So in this example, we've said only consider this rule if the invoice is up to $5,000. If the invoice is over that amount, then it needs to use a different rule. Once you've defined the rule, then similar to the matching rule, we need to link it to a profile so that it can then be connected to a service provider. So to link it to a profile, we now go to the invoice approval rule profile. Again, pulling up an existing example. So here we have the rule profile ID, which has been created, again, with a unique naming condition. And then we can link one or multiple rules to the profile. In this case, there is the 3% rule we just viewed. Again, if we use multiple rules linked to this profile, we use the sequence as a precedence to specify which one should be considered first, then which one is next, and so on. Once you define your rules, then again, these need to be linked to your service providers. So from your contract and rate management section, you would access the service provider for which you want to use this. Here, we'll use our example of C.H. Robinson again, accessing the service provider. And then going down to the settlement section, we would access the invoice approval rule profile. Again, use the lookups to access the profile we want to use. Select. And then once linked to the carrier, we could save to finish. And now we would now be using this particular rule profile for the invoice approval levels. Again, let's go back to our topic. To summarize, OTM's invoice approval rules enforce your organization's requirements for approving invoices for payment by ensuring that user-defined thresholds have been satisfied. The invoice approval rule are used only after invoices have first passed the invoice matching rule criteria. Additionally, these rules can be executed automatically or invoked manually. Thanks for viewing our topic.